if you have any difficulty with the slides. Yes, and as Melissa just had said, we are recording, so any questions on any of that will be on the recording. So just so you're aware. Perfect. So here is kind of what we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about speech and language and play development. So of course, welcome to everyone. Oh, I went backwards. There we go. So this is our agenda for our time together today. I just thought I will quickly introduce myself, and then I will kind of go on to talk about the difference between speech, language, and communication. Oftentimes these terms are kind of used like interchangeably, but for us SLPs, like we kind of think of them as different things. We're then going to talk about the development of speech sounds and the speech sound system. We're then going to kind of talk briefly about phonological disorders versus articulation disorders and motor speech disorders. We're then going to talk about language development, and then developmental language delays, expressive and receptive language delays. We have in here in the agenda, I guess I didn't update it, but we're going to talk about play development. And then in the end, we're going to talk about strategies. So some strategies that you can do to support general communication development. And of course, questions for the at the end. So please, as Melissa said, just ask me anytime. I have no trouble with any interruptions, like just, speak out or raise your hand, or if you'd like to put them in the chat, that's great as well. So about Speech and Speech Matters SLP services. So that's our organization founded by myself. So we are a group of SLPs and OTs, occupational therapists, and we provide pan-disability accessible, respectful therapy services that really aim to honor the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our clients. A big cornerstone of our organization is empowerment and empowering our families and clients by giving them the tools to support communication and participation in daily life. Kind of think of myself as, a speech and language coach. Like I have this information, but I am by no means want to gatekeep it. I want to share it and I want to enhance everyone's toolbox. I always say if in therapy, we get to a point where you feel like you don't need me anymore, I feel that's the best. That's like the best place that I want to be, because that means that you feel comfortable with your strategies. You feel that you are meeting your goals and everything is going really, really well. So we want to share our information. We offer in-person services here in Calgary, as well as in Edmonton, and then virtual services all over British Columbia and Alberta. So a little bit about myself. So oftentimes I have done this with a few of our other SLPs, but unfortunately it's just me today. So you'll have to listen to me talk for a long stretch of time. But so again, my name is Holly Smith. My pronouns are she, her. I've been a speech language pathologist I always look to the information as if I don't know it about myself. So it's always seems so funny talking about yourself, but I've been a speech language pathologist for almost 13 years now. I'm registered both in British Columbia with the College of Speech and Hearing Health Professionals of British Columbia, as well as here in Alberta with the Alberta College of Speech Language Pathologists and Audiologists, as well as our federal advocacy group and governing body, Speech and Audiology Canada. I have had the privilege of working in both pediatrics and with adult clients throughout the span of my career. So I kind of consider myself a bit of a generalist and have provide like a breadth of service. Something I'm really passionate about is providing speech and language services to Indigenous communities and Indigenous families, and providing culturally sensitive treatment and assessment to our Indigenous communities. And that's something that I kind of currently spend a great chunk of my time with, and I'm really, really honored and privileged to do that. So that's a little bit about me and kind of where I'm coming from my, I guess, place of expertise. So the first thing that I kind of want to get into is talking about speech and language and communication, because as I had mentioned when talking about the agenda, these terms sometimes are used interchangeably. Sometimes with SLPs, we often think of like speech therapy. And it's kind of one of my top 5 SLP questions is people kind of ask me as a speech therapist what we do. And oftentimes people think of like speech sounds, so like lisps or fluency and stuttering. And that's kind of what people think of as a speech language pathologist. But there's actually these different domains and areas that we can support work on. So speech is, of course, our ability to produce individual sounds that make up words of a specific language. So like our sound. So that is what we mean by speech, is just purely making all these sounds that make up our words. Language, on the other hand, is kind of our symbolic rule-governed system that we use to convey messages. So that is how our brain organizes like our words and our sentences and use of grammar, and puts that all together to help us send and receive messages. With with language, you can have your receptive language, which is your understanding of language, so your receiving of messages in language, and your expressive language, so your ability to express yourself. When we talk about communication, that's kind of like the bigger umbrella term, and that is talking about the sharing of information. And the great thing about communication is we're not necessarily meaning verbal communication only, we're also meaning nonverbal communication, such as like using sign language or behavior or body language, facial expression. Communication is what we're referring to is just sharing of information. And again, that can be done on like a one-on-one scale, so talking between two people, and like at a larger scale, like right now I'm communicating with our group, and it can be done even at like a bigger scale, like in a billboard that's communicating a message, in Times Square, or in downtown Vancouver or something like that. That is kind of under that umbrella of communication. So that's kind of these three different terms that you may see pop up in like SLP reports and what we're referring to in each of those areas. So our first kind of chunk in talking about development is we're going to talk about speech. So how do children acquire speech sounds? So, all of this starts from the very, very beginning, so early. So in those early days, 0 to 6 weeks, we're looking at reflexive vocalization, such as like crying, sucking, sneezing, coughing. And so these are kind of things we're starting to see right with newborn babies. From about 6 weeks to about 16 weeks or 4 months, we start to see infants beginning to coo and laugh. About 4 months to 30 weeks, so just before kind of about 6 months, then we're starting to see some vocal play. So we're seeing like some vowel sounds, we're seeing some stretching of vowel sounds, so longer sounds, shorter sounds. And sometimes we will begin to see limited consonant sounds begin to come up in this age group. The first consonant sounds you're going to see, and I should have like a visual on another slide, is a lot of those highly visual sounds. So sounds that the babies can really see you making and begin to imitate. So we see a lot of those like bilabial sounds. So like babas, mama, wawa, those sounds that really involve our lips that are highly visual. From 6 to 10 months, so that kind of latter months of babyhood, if we're thinking of that first year, that's when we start to see some reduplicated babbling. So that's when we might see like ba, 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 ma, 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 and containing those consonant vowel combos. So like ba, ma, and these are often kind of repeated in long strings. A little bit after that, in 10 to 14 months, we're beginning to see some different vowel and consonant combinations and doing some syllable strings, which we call variegated babbling. And we also start to see some nice like intonation and stress patterns that kind of mimic real words. And we also see these first proto words and first words. We say proto word because that is generally when a child uses the same word consistently and attaches meaning to an object or what they're referring to, but it may not be exactly as like we would say it. So something might be like baba for bottle. The child is using that intentionally every time to refer to their bottle, and that has meaning. So that is like a proto word for bottle. And the good thing I just want to say too about these kind of ranges, I often when I chat with families, I think sometimes there can be a little bit of anxiety. I know as a new mom myself, like I really had felt that about these development and ranges and milestones. Like I think of it as like milestone anxiety and seeing like, oh goodness, we're 16 weeks and I'm not seeing this kind of vocal play that when I pop into Google on my phone, I see that my child should be doing. And I always preface that development is a range. No one child will develop the same way. I have 2 daughters and their developmental pattern continues to be completely different. And I think, again, it's just a range. And oftentimes when you're talking to a professional, they should really be looking at your child holistically. So looking at the whole picture. If a child is not meeting, quote unquote, one milestone, but they may be doing many, many other things on their development spectrum. And so I think all of that puts together a greater picture of development versus isolating one single skill and thinking that, oh, my child is not meeting this one skill at this recommended range or timeline that's given. Any questions about this kind of stuff? This is kind of a bit like theory heavy, but good information to have, especially if you're working with those little ones. So when we talk about our articulators, this is just good information to have. So these are the things that are involved in our oral mechanism or oral motor muscles that involve speech. So these are the things that we use. So we use our teeth, our tongue, our lips, and our palate. And these are all the things that are involved in making our different speech sounds. In English too, we also use our nose or our nasal cavity to produce sounds, like our and our sound are considered our nasal sounds, where air is directed up through our nasal cavity. So I get kind of questions too a lot about sometimes when children are having trouble making sounds or acquiring sounds. Oftentimes we kind of think, is there anything structurally going on, like with their articulators or with their teeth, or tongue ties is another thing that you may hear a lot about. And so these are kind of all the different articulators that we would be looking at. And oftentimes when you meet with an SLP, if there is anything going on in terms of speech, they will do what's called like an oral motor exam, or kind of look at the oral mechanism to ensure that there isn't anything structural that could be impacting speech or speech sound development. Both my girls had tongue ties, and those had to be clipped like very, very early on, which with little babies can often impact like feeding or suckling at first, but then later down the road, not always, but can sometimes have implications for speech. So this graph here, this is kind of our development of speech sounds, because there are developmentally appropriate errors that we expect to see in young children. So like a 2-year-old, for example, they don't have all the sounds acquired in their speech sound system yet, and they may often use patterns of simplification because communicating is more important than perfect speech at that age. So our 2-year-olds, their brain is brilliant, and so it's helped them simplify their speech so they can start getting their messages out sooner, because that oral mechanism is often not mature enough in terms of like motor planning and structure to begin making some of the later developing speech sounds. But those kiddos start getting words out quite quickly. So in that 2 to 3 years, and also these norms were updated too recently. So if you've seen some of these charts maybe hanging around your preschool classroom or in like your preschool or ECE center, it was updated as of 2018. So this is kind of the new updated norms. It was like a big shocker in the speech world. It was, big news, which was exciting. So for 2 to 3, these are kind of some of the early developing sounds that we're looking at. So we're looking again at those bilabial sounds. So that b, p, m, and w, as well as beginning to look at some of our alveolar sounds. So like d, t, some of our nasal sounds like m, our more open sounds like h, and some of our back sounds like k and g, and f and y and ing. So these are kind of some of the early sounds that you'll hear. Some of those later sounds that are often in error kind of after 3 are our L sound, our j sound, ch, s, v, sh, and z. So again, these are sounds that often we kind of highlight and hear like, some kids might be having trouble with their L sound or sound. And this is a good graph to let you know maybe when we would think it's developmentally appropriate and when we may want to intervene. Going on up at 5 years old, so some of the later developing sounds is that R sound and that TH sound, so voiced around 5 and voiceless. So for voiced, we mean a word like the or brother, and voiceless, and that's when I say voice, that's when your voice is kind of turning on. You can feel your vocal folds are coming together and we're getting that vibration of sounds. So that is a voiced sound. A voiceless sound is when your vocal folds are still open and air is passing through. So that is more like think and 3, and it has a bit more of that breathy quality. So again, that's kind of those development of those sounds and when we would expect those sounds to be in place. How do kids acquire these sounds? They acquire them in this predictable order, and they acquire them through modeling. So by modeling with the adults and the community members like in their environment. At birth, like every child has the ability to make any sound depending on their language system and their modeling and their exposure. And then we kind of prune that out, or it becomes more sophisticated as that child grows and develops and gets more and more modeling. So again, just quickly, you might hear a difference about like phonological disorders and articulation disorders. And again, that might be something you see on your speech report or when talking to an SLP. And they're actually kind of two different types of disorders that are impacting that speech sound system. So articulation is when we're focusing on like a single sound. So often the most common example is like a lisp. So if a child is having a distortion in that sound, maybe it's produced like between the teeth. So like a sound, or even lateral, like a sound, but it's just that one sound. It's present throughout their speech, but only that sound. We would call that like an articulation disorder or distortion. Phonology, however, is when the child is using like a pattern that is impacting multiple sounds across like multiple different words, but it's following this like kind of predictable rule-based order. So an example is like a final consonant deletion. So you'll hear this in a lot of 2-year-olds. So they might, because at that time it's developmentally appropriate. They're simplifying their speech to get their message out. So I have a 2-year-old and my younger daughter, so we have a cat named Goose. And so since he's come into our home, he's Goo cat. Or she doesn't even say cat, she says cat, like Goo cat, because she's deleting that final consonant, which for her age is developmentally appropriate. If we're seeing this later on and children are kind of deleting that final sound across many words, then that would be considered like a phonological delay or a phonological disorder. Another kind of phonological disorder that's quite common is with those blends. So those speech sound buddies. So if you have a learner, a child saying like pider for spider, so they're kind of eliminating one of those sounds in that speech buddy blend, that would be kind of considered a phonological disorder versus articulation. So, and please let me know if I'm chatting too fast or if anyone has any questions so far. I'll keep going, but let me know. So just to kind of a graphic as well. So how speech sound disorders, kind of where they come from. Articulation and phonological disorders, like the most common ones that we see in terms of development, those are functional speech sound disorders, meaning that they have no known cause. So there's no reason often why kids have these disorders. Other kind of speech sound disorders may have a cause, like a motor speech sound disorder, which is something like an apraxia of speech that you may be familiar with. Structural, which could be like, again, that tongue tie or cleft palate or any other orofacial abnormalities. Or sensory perceptual, which would be like a hearing impairment. So when that sensory and perceptual system is impacting a child's development of their speech. So a quick bit about motor speech disorders, because I know apraxia of speech is something that you may come across like in your centers, or if like your EC or teacher, or working in classrooms. So motor speech disorders, they're characterized by the difficulty to move the articulators. So that kind of picture that I showed you with like your teeth and your tongue and your jaw and your palate. So the motor speech is when you're having difficulty moving your oral motor mechanism or your articulators to produce these speech sounds. It can be due to like weakness or like difficulty with like innervation to these muscles. And so that would be something like a dysarthria, where the child has the right motor plan and they're making that sound, but there's weakness happening with the muscles and the coordination of those speech sounds. More commonly is apraxia, and that's when there is actually no weakness and no difficulty with range of motion. Like everything kind of looks on the surface looks good, but where the problem is with that motor plan. So that map from your brain that sends the message to your articulators about how to make a sound, there's a disconnect there with a child who has, or a person who has apraxia. And then the message is getting disrupted. So what the articulators are doing when they're trying to form those sounds don't match that sound. So things you may see with apraxia are different error patterns. So it may look a little bit different each time. You might see a little bit of oral groping. So it's like the child or person is trying to like make those sounds. They often do better with like a visual model. So like watching someone make the sound. And yeah, so apraxia of speech is kind of a more common motor planning speech disorder that you may see in like a pediatric population. So shifting now to language. So how do children acquire language? So one of the big questions that I get a lot is like, do we need to kind of teach our children to talk? No, that's kind of debunked. Children acquire language generally quickly and easily without formal teaching. Again, they really acquire it by immersion, interaction, and modeling. So it typically happens automatically whether their parents try to teach them or not. So again, focusing on interaction, they get this through interacting with other adults and other children. Typically, developing children will acquire the language that is being used around them. So this also applies to like multilingual households, as long as there are regular interaction in the target languages. And I believe, have a slide a little bit later on about bilingual households or multilingual households and language development. So how can we support language acquisition? So we know from research that using baby talk that we use with like infants or toddlers we want to use that just a little bit ahead of where the child is. So we're kind of modeling a new skill through our language that we're giving them. So when we use baby talk, we're using simpler vocabulary, simpler sentence structure, and we're using a lot of exaggerated intonation and sounds and a lot of repetitions. And all these features really help children acquire language. So I think some people think like baby talk, like, no, that's not good. And I think what's important is we're still using like complete sentence structure. We're still using complete grammar and complete words, but what we're doing is maybe simplifying the grammar that we're using, simplifying our sentences so it's not very, very long, and we're really exaggerating the patterns of language that can really help with that language acquisition. So here are just some milestones. So for language, so 6 to 11 months, so that latter half of kind of that first year of babyhood, children are beginning to start to understand some simple commands like no or stop. And oftentimes babies are beginning to communicate nonverbally with gestures like pointing. Oftentimes too, babies can pick up baby sign quite quickly at this age, so they can start using some signs for more or help or please, so they can start using those to communicate. 12 to 17 months. So this is when children are kind of answering very simple questions, either non-verbally or with like single words. They might have a vocabulary of 4 to 6 words. Often pronunciation is not very clear, or as I always say, like, you know, parent or caregiver will absolutely understand, but someone who's not maybe familiar with that child may not be a bit unclear about what they're talking about. 12 to 23 months, that's when we start to see the beginning of 2-word phrases, because we see a lot of explosion and growth in their single word vocabulary. So often, kiddos, they need to acquire a lot of single words in their vocabulary or their lexicon before they're beginning to combine those. So a lot of these first words are like common foods, animals, objects, family members, and approximately we think about 50 words, again, oftentimes still with that unclear pronunciation. And again, just remember my caveat about range. So we know on average, it's about 50 words, but we know that that's, again, that range, and that average means that some children may have a lot more and some children may have less. This is, again, that range. And lots of things count as words. I think parents often, there's more words that we are checking off on our list when we're chatting than parents perhaps are, like things like animal sounds, like, moo or ba, or exclamations like uh-oh, things like that. We are all counting as words, as well as signs, anything that they are attaching and applying meaning to and using consistently, like we're considering words. From 2 to 3, we're often seeing some like 3-word phrases. They might start using some like spatial concepts like on or off. They might use some pronouns like me or my, some descriptive words like hot or cold, or maybe some colors. They might start using some plurals like, books, more books, and some past tense verbs like, so, we walked to the store. They're starting to answer some simple WH questions, again, verbally or non-verbally. Speech is starting to become clear, and strangers, though, still may have trouble understanding. And they're also beginning to follow some two-step directions, like, really functional contextual directions. So, okay, like go get your shoes and meet me at the door. So there's 2 steps, and like your little 2 to 3-year-old might like hop to it. I love that. If I find that 2 to 3-year-old age, they're like the biggest helpers and always doing a fantastic job understanding directions versus my 5-year-old who probably has a stronger understanding of language, but does not seem to follow the directions quite as well, or might need many, many more repetitions. So continuing 3 to 4, that's where we're starting to understand and identify like object groups and categories and talking about things like colors and functions of things. Most people can understand the speech between 3 to 4, but they may struggle with some of the later developing or more difficult speech sounds. They begin talking about things not in the present or things that are not exactly tangible, like thoughts or feelings. They might start using more action words, like with ing. And we're seeing kind of those 1 to 4 word phrases or some longer sentences. 4 to 5, language is just continuing to expand. And so we might see some more spatial concepts like behind and near. Speech is mostly clear with some more difficulties with like complex multisyllabic words. So that's where you might hear, a word like Zamboni might have I think every parent has a great memory of something that their child said that they simplified into something totally adorable. Like spaghetti is like spaghetti, the Zamboni is the Zamoni. So again, those multisyllabic words, they're kind of simplifying. They're understanding some more complex questions like why or how when thinking about things. And they might start using some of those simple irregular past tense verbs like ran and fell instead of like I falled or I run. They might say like, yeah, like I fell. 5 years, so around that kindergarten age, we're understanding some sequential concepts. So they know about things happening first and second and last, following 3-step directions. They're beginning to understand some of those like pre-literacy concepts like rhyme and wordplay and initial sounds, and maybe connecting first sounds to like sounds in their name. They might begin to use like compound sentences, so connecting ideas with and or because or so. And lots of more complex sentences, so longer utterances like 8+ words. And oftentimes at this age, they're engaging in conversation, like you can have a clear kind of back and forth with that 5-year-old. So this is kind of the general things that we're looking at in terms of language for those early years. So what I had mentioned again in the agenda, but when we talk about a language delay or disorder, we'll often kind of further narrow that down by talking about a receptive language disorder. And that is, again, the receiving of messages, so the understanding of messages. So if a child's having trouble following directions or attending to a teacher in a classroom or has trouble kind of understanding different question types, we would maybe be looking at them having difficulty with their receptive language. Expressive language is difficulty using language to express themselves. So this may be in like verbal speech, writing, sign language, or on AAC devices. So any sort of modality that they're using to express themselves. A new label we have is a developmental language disorder. So previously this was called an SLI, which was like a specific language impairment. And this is when we are using this for challenges seen in this understanding and or using language. So it can be both, it could be one or the other. And again, a developmental language disorder, there's no known cause, but this can also impact like future academics or education or learning new language concepts. So it's something that we would want to support. So these are kind of the terms that you might see in terms of language delays and disorders. So now I'm going to shift into play. So if there's any questions about language, like please, yell them out or throw them in the chat, but I'll keep going. So social communication. So this is when the use of language in social context. So this is also kind of connected through to play skills. So skills in this area are the ability to like take the perspective of others, understand and appropriately like use the rules of language and nonverbal and verbal communication, and kind of vary your speech style. So oftentimes social communication disorders, these are characterized by difficulty with those areas. So difficulty with perspective taking, difficulty with nonverbal language, difficulty with conversational language. Another term you may see is pragmatics. So if a child has like difficulty with pragmatics, they're having difficulty with their social use of language or social communication. So they may not communicate like appropriately for the context or the environment. They may have difficulty like adapting their communication style to their listener. They may not even be aware that their communication partner is not understanding them. So again, that's that difficulty with perspective taking, or perhaps like referencing their partner. They may have trouble like following rules for conversation, like taking turns. And they may have trouble like understanding things that aren't like in the here and now or explicitly stated. So kind of that reading between the lines skill that we kind of acquire. So here are some social communication benchmarks. So I won't go through all of these because there's a lot on here, but you will get a chance, I think, to have the slides. So if you wanted to come back and look through this a little bit more in depth, you'll be able to do so. So in that early first year, 0 to 12 months, that's when we start to see babies preferring to look at human faces and listening to human voices. They start smiling at caregivers. They might participate in some of that vocal play back and forth. They might begin to show some of that, or they should begin to show some of that joint attention. So kind of we're both attending and looking at a one object, so sharing attention, or one person. 1 to 2, so we're starting to see that they're communicating with gestures or limited words. They might participate in communication rituals like waving hi and waving bye. They might respond with like eye contact. So if someone's talking to them, they might look and make eye contact with whoever's talking to them. They might again take some like limited turn takings in the beginnings of conversation. 2 to 3, they might have some short dialogues. They might like introduce like or change a topic or bring up something that they're interested in. They might begin to use language in a really imaginative way. They might like clarify or ask for clarification, so begin to ask some questions. And they also begin at this age to adapt their speech to like different listeners. So they might talk to their peers differently than they would talk to their teacher or their parents or other family members. For 3 to 4 years, that's when, again, we're getting in longer dialogues. They might also start to show some like anticipation in conversation, so know that their turn is coming and thinking of what to say. They might begin to code switch and use like simpler language when talking to littler kids. So they know that kids maybe won't understand like a longer utterance, so they'll change that. They begin, using language for like jokes or telling stories or, doing funny things. And they'll also begin to make, which I think is really important, conversation repairs. So when they're not understood or there's been like a communication breakdown, at this age, they'll start kind of saying like, no, I said this, or no, that's not what I said, and begin to try and repair that and ensure that you're understanding. So for school age children, so getting a little bit older, so in preschool and kindergarten, we begin to see kids are kind of making, using like terms like here and that. So kind of those catch-all words. They might begin to discuss like emotions and feelings more effectively. They might begin to be telling stories that follow like a simple narrative structure that you can follow with like a beginning, a middle, and end. At this age too, really, really importantly, children begin to discover that basic understanding of theory of mind. So I'm not sure if that's something that you're all familiar with, but basically it's that your theory of mind is when you know that how you think and feel and how you perceive things may be different from how another person thinks or feels or perceives things. Oftentimes kids when they're very young have that kind of very egocentric viewpoint. So kind of what's happening to them or their needs, that's what's mattering to them. And that theory of mind, they begin to separate that my feelings and my needs and how I'm feeling may be separate from yours. So in grade school, we start to see increased understanding of that theory of mind. So they may begin to read body language or facial expressions. So now it's past, I'm aware that you may feel differently from me, but then I can look at you and I can see maybe some clues that will help clue me into perhaps like how you're feeling or how you're reading this situation. We see improved ability to like use and understand that nonverbal communication. We see the ability to provide like assistance to others, so they may want to jump in and try and help. And they use some of that story grammar, so like setting up different characters or setting or like what the problem is. Better conversational skills, so like they're able to stay on topic, take more turns, and they might like expand their conversational topics, so they might be able to kind of have conversations about a greater number of things. And they also might be able to use language to like persuade or express opinion. That's what we're starting to see in those school age years. So I'm just looking at time. Okay. 6 stages of play. So this is how kind of play develops. So unoccupied play is that beginning play, that 0 to 3 months. That's when babies kind of moving hands. We have those fun, I think of them as like gyms, like little baby gyms where things that are exciting for them to look at kind of hang down, and you'll see babies kind of trying to bat them or see how they move, moving their body, figuring out like, oh, I move my arm and this happens. From 0 to 2 years, we have that solitary play, and that's when kids are kind of playing alone and they're not really interested in playing with others. They may be just kind of more exploring their environment. That's specter or onlooking behavior. So that's when a child is that's about 2. And when a child's beginning to observe other kids and start maybe imitate some of the play or things that they're doing, they're not necessarily playing with them, but they're kind of watching and seeing, okay. So I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, as I've said, and my 2-year-old has now just started. My older daughter is really into like characters, like, and they have like conversations and things happening. And my little daughter has now started to bring a character to her older sister's scenes, and she'll just say, hi, but she's kind of observing like, oh, this is what happens. We take these characters and they chat, or we go into the bunny house or whatever it is. But she's kind of learned that from that spectator and watching her older sister. Parallel play again starts at 2 and continues on, and that's when a child will play like alongside another child, beside them. Again, they're not playing with them, but they're kind of beside each other, may even be doing the same thing. Associate play, so that's when they start to interact with others, but there's not like a lot of cooperation. So they may both be like playing with blocks, but they're doing different things, or they're both kind of on the playground, but they're not really maybe doing something jointly together. And cooperative play is at 4+, like around 4. And that's when they're playing with others and they have an interest in playing with others, and they begin to kind of work together and involve other kids or other play partners in their play. Some other kind of play that wasn't really mentioned in that graphic that's really important is like sensory motor play. So that's like exploratory play where a child engages in like repetitive movements. So that's when they might be doing things like drumming or mouthing things or banging and making noise. And that's when they're engaging these movements to like see how things feel, how their body works when they do that. Constructive play is another great phase, which is really involved in kind of like building things. Dramatic play is often in those older years, like after 4, and that's when they're beginning to have, it's kind of like pretend play, like when there's something happening or a theme or a scenario, and there's role playing where the children have like different roles in this theme. And they may also begin to have like representation skills, so where an object is not used as what it is in the play. So like a banana might not be a banana, it might be like the phone to call the fire department, because in our play scene there's like a fire happening and we need to role play that. So that's that dramatic play. So here, let's get to some strategies. So these are often the first basic strategies that I share with parents, or I think are really, really good things to share if, like, you're working in a preschool or a daycare classroom and a parent is concerned about their child's speech and language. These are the things that they can do at home. So we want to create a language-rich home environment. So basically, we really want to amp up that exposure and modeling to language. So the first is through like quantity. So we want to hear lots and lots of different words. Well, lots of words, I should say. Different is the next one in terms of quality. So we know that hearing lots and lots of words in those first 3 years has a really big positive impact in terms of development and speech and language development. Quality is also, we want to hear a lot of words, and we want to hear a lot of varied words. So we want to hear lots of different words. And we also want to hear lots of different sentence structure and lots of different question forms. So a lot of variety. A great way that this can be done is through book reading. So every speech pathologist will be like, well, read books, love, love, love books. And we love books for so many reasons. A big one is for this, because it's written in the text, all these different words, these different sentence structures, different ideas. So reading lots of books is a great way to ensure that that's happening at home. The other thing we want to do in our language-rich environment is we really want to acknowledge all the way that our child is trying to communicate. So we really want to watch for, we want to be those great speech and language detectives and watch for how they are trying to communicate something. What is their body language telling me? Are they pointing? What are they gesturing? Their expression, their eye gaze. We always talk about, like in our practice, about really honoring all forms of communication. I think oftentimes we really think of verbal communication as where we're ultimately trying to go. So you might often hear a very well-intentioned parent, and I mean, gosh, I've done it myself as well, saying like, use your words or tell me with your words. And I think as a child, that's really frustrating because they're communicating that in a different way. If a child is pointing to maybe their milk cup or something on the counter, they're communicating with me. I want to acknowledge that. I maybe want to model that verbal word. So I might say like, oh, you want your milk? Here's your milk cup. Next time you could say, milk, please. Or next time I'm getting something, I might say, oh, I'm going to get some milk, please. And I'm modeling that, but I'm not going to try and make that child repeat their utterance or cause frustration. So I wouldn't say like, use your words or withhold that item, because I want to acknowledge their communication. Because if I don't, then it teaches them like, I'm trying to communicate with you and it wasn't successful, so maybe I won't try that again. Or it doesn't help build kind of that serve and return interaction that really allows for expanded language modeling. So we really want to acknowledge all the different ways that children are trying to communicate, verbally and non-verbally. Continuing with that language-rich environment is play. We really want to play with our kids. And again, another caveat, I often, as parents, I think it comes with a lot of guilt because I know we're doing everything we can for our kids. So I think often it's like we think, oh gosh, I need to be playing. I need to be on the floor doing this all the time. And unfortunately, that's just not realistic, right? Because we also need to like make dinner and do the laundry and fill out the forms or, take some time for yourself. So I think having some quality one-on-one time of play where you're following your child's lead, including their interests on their level every day is fantastic. Building that in, I think, is really, really important. Is it something we need to do all the time? Of course not. Because on the flip side, you can be modeling self-talk. So when you're cooking dinner or doing the laundry, modeling what you're doing and talking about that is still providing like an awesome language model as opposed to doing that one-on-one, like down on the floor play. The last really important one is comments over questions. So again, I think as adults, like it's kind of built into us when we're interacting with a new child, we want to get them to talk. We want to hear about them. So we will ask them questions. And a lot of times these either result in like short answers and it teaches kids to kind of be responders versus initiators. So if we make comments or things that we notice and use a lot of comments in our play, I think it kind of promotes the kids being initiators and sharing what they want to talk about, or they may comment back to you about what you're interested in. So I always say comments over questions. General rule of thumb, we say like for every 8 comments we make, maybe we'll make 1 question. Very hard to do, but that's just kind of a general number that we kind of keep in mind. So again, interaction. So tips for encouraging that interaction, because sometimes I hear, in sessions or with other community providers is that it can be tricky to sometimes engage certain kids. So they're thinking like, yeah, I mean, that's great. Like I'm there, I'm trying to interact with this child, but it's not so easy. So here are some great strategies for that. So we want to think firstly of those 4 S's. So we want to say less, stress our words, go slow, and show. So oftentimes as the adult, we're kind of like the dominant talker in our play or our interaction, and we really want to pull back and say less. So like sometimes we don't even need to say anything. We really want to allow for that space to encourage that child to engage with us or feel comfortable interacting with us or maybe using their own communication. We want to stress some of our key words. So again, we're kind of highlighting some of the few words. We want to go slow with that interaction. So we may not want to jump in. We may just want to take our time, and we may want to show them new toys, show them what we're doing. So doing more showing versus like talking. The other kind of way in terms of interaction that I really like is the 4 I's. So we got the 4 S's and the 4 I's. So the 4 I's are include. So you want to include their interests. You want to interpret their messages. So see kind of what they're doing and interpret what they're trying to tell you with their body language or how they're playing. You want to imitate what they're doing, and then you kind of want to gently intrude. So for example, if you're kind of working, so I work with a lot of school age kids currently, and They love, and so they come into speech therapy to come see me, and I'm often like, oh, hey, like, how's it going? Like, full of energy, really trying to engage them. And I often get like, how are you today? Well, okay. What did you do today? I don't know. What do you want to do in therapy? I don't know. Do you have a game that you want to play? So we're stuck, right? Where I'm not doing so well at getting that interaction. So what I want to do is I want to include their interests. So if I know this learner is really, I've talked a lot about 5 Nights at Freddy lately. This is, I guess, something that's become quite popular, or things like Fortnite, or like, gosh, I've even talked about things like Call of Duty, things that I don't know anything about, but these video games are really like high areas of interest for this age group. So we're going to include these interests in what we're talking about. We're going to start our conversation by chatting about that. Maybe we'll bring up some images about that. Maybe we're going to include that in our activity. So including their interests is a big, big way to get that interaction. You also want to interpret their message. So if I see a learner who's kind of like, seems low energy, not really looking at me, shrugging their shoulders, I can interpret that I'm not really grabbing them. They're not really interested. This isn't really like lighting their fire, revving their engine, and I need to maybe change my approach. You also want to maybe imitate what they're doing. So oftentimes too, like on the flip side with maybe like a very young kiddo, maybe they're lining up their cars or they're lining up their toys and they're very interested in that. And you're coming up and you're asking them about their toys, you're asking them what they're doing, and they're not really answering you. Like they're just kind of focused on what they're doing. So to engage with them, I might get my own cars and right beside them start lining up my cars. So I'm going to imitate exactly what they're doing and show them like, okay, like I see what you're doing. This is what we're doing. I'm going to do it with you. And then if you feel it's a good time, you want to gently intrude. So you may want to try and like put one of your cars in their line, or you may want to try and put up maybe like a little gas station at the end. So you're kind of gently maybe intruding on their play when you feel it's the right time. We don't want to frustrate kids. We don't want to be kind of coming in at that wrong time where maybe they're not warmed up or they're not ready for interaction. That's where that interpreting really comes in, that kind of when it's a good time to maybe insert yourself a bit. 2 other fantastic strategies, I call it owling. So that's observe, wait, and listen. So that's when you're observing the child, you're waiting and you're listening. You're listening for all these cues. Watching and waiting and listening, huge. And the last one are these rock routines, we call them, which is just you're repeating what you're doing. You're offering lots of opportunities. You might use cues or questions to keep it going. So we want to really kind of keep these interactions going. These are all from Hannon. I've done a lot of Hannon throughout my career. So if you're familiar with Hannon, this is where you can find kind of more information about those strategies. So if we're thinking of speech development, so if we're just, because a lot of learners you may see in your centers or in your classrooms or in your community may have difficulty with speech, this is what we want to be doing for that. Here's some great strategies. The first one you do is you want to model and recast. So you want to show the child the speech sounds and model them how you use them. And again, this is just modeling. So we're not stopping the child and saying like, oh, like say your sound, like we're going to do it like this. We're just glossing back over, recasting what they're saying. So if they're saying like, oh, could I please have like a tutti? You say, oh, you want a cookie. Yeah, here's your cookie. Yeah, here you go, chocolate chip cookie. And I'm highlighting that k sound that was an error in their speech and maybe even adding in a few extra opportunities for them to hear it. And I might stress it as well. So I might be adding like a hand signal that we use like for that k sound to draw their attention to it. I might make it stronger, like louder and stronger. So like, oh, your cookie? Okay, here's your cookie. Here you go. So they're hearing it. They're hearing that in my speech. Again, like when we're cueing or prompting, we want to use lots of different kinds of cues and prompts. So again, I might want to use my hand signal to show them where that sound is made. We might want to use a visual, like a mirror, or any sort of verbal cues as well. If we're telling them about that sound, we want to give sounds names. So oftentimes we have like our snake sound or our coughing sound, our like, popcorn sound. So anything that will help connect, like increase their awareness of their sound and connect them to help seeing and beginning to increase their awareness of where that sound pops up in their speech. And that's, I guess, it continues there and having fun. We want to name the sounds and we want to hear and highlight that sound in our everyday activities. And then we really want to reinforce and acknowledge efforts. So we often want to be really specific with our feedback. So, oh, like, good job. Like, I really heard you using your popcorn sound there. Oh, or, oh, I really saw you keep your lips closed when we were making that sound. That's fantastic. Another thing that's not on here too, when there's speech sounds and if we're having trouble understanding kiddos, because that can be really frustrating for them. If they're really trying to give us a message and we are not understanding, we want to blame ourselves. So as the listener, so we don't want to put the onus on them. We want to blame us so that we're the ones having trouble. So I will often say, oh, you are doing such a good job trying to help me understand this word, this new word for me. So I'm hearing it like this. Am I close? Was there something else? Maybe could you show me or point to me to help me understand? Because my ears are having trouble understanding this. Like, you are doing a great job trying to tell me this. I'm the one having trouble understanding that. So these are some great speech strategies. More strategies for that early language development after that kind of creating that language rich home is we want to give lots and lots of wait time. So we want to allow kids lots of time to respond. So oftentimes, like, if we think kids kind of aren't responding right away, we're very quick to jump in because naturally we're helpers and we want to help them communicate. But by giving them more and more time, we kind of promote that independence, help them come up with their words on their own. So or their communication strategies on their own. So lots and lots of time is good. We also want to ask only one question at a time. So I often think of this as like fishing. So if we ask one question and we don't get a response right away, sometimes we might follow up with more questions. So I might repeat my question, I might change my question or ask another question because in my mind, I'm thinking that they didn't understand. But all that really does is it's like I'm fishing and I'm putting in multiple lines all in the same spot, and it's all going to get all tangled and muddied up, because that's going to take the child even longer to now process all this language input that you've front loaded or put into their brain and then get their response. So if you've asked one question, I say just wait and give them time to respond to that one question. We also often want to do a lot of expansions or recasting. So if a child is, speaking with single words, we might want to help them expand by add another word. So if a child's reading a book with you and they point out dog, you might say, oh, yes, I see a big dog, a big brown dog. So again, I'm taking what they're doing and I'm expanding it. I'm adding words. So expanding, you can either expand with the amount of words or with the sentence structure is another way to expand. We really always want to use those serve and return interactions. So if a child begins a communication interaction with you, like they're serving a tennis ball to you, you want to respond to that. So you want to make sure that you're always watching for those communication attempts and what that child is communicating, because if you miss it, then we miss that interaction and that opportunity for language modeling. Again, we really want to make reading a big part of your routine. Reading is so important, both for all that language modeling and that core connection time. And reading doesn't just have to be the words in the book. A lot of young kids, and my daughter, my second daughter, was the exact same. She could not sit for a book for the life of her. And so I often felt like I would start a book and then she'd be gone. She was running, body was too busy. So I think with those little early ones, there's nothing wrong with kind of just flipping through the book together, making it short, pointing out a few pictures, having the child move around the room while you're reading, even watching you read. Even if they're not sitting down with you, they are getting something out of that. They're learning about that book awareness, print awareness, hearing all the words, and they will definitely, I'm sure, begin to continue to engage in those reading activities as they continue to grow and develop. And the last one on this slide, we also really want to create those communication opportunities. So we really want to try and maximize our environment and the situation to allow for a lot of different communication opportunities. You might have heard this called, or still now, communication temptations or things like gentle sabotage. And that's when we're kind of setting up the situation to promote that communication. So we might give breakfast cereal, but forget our spoon. And we might wait, because then maybe we want kind of our young child or our learner to kind of clue us in that they need a spoon. And this is often tricky because as parents, I think we're so tuned into anticipating our children's needs that we're always right there. When they come in and they're hungry, it's we're right there with the snack, we know what they want. But if we want to create a communication opportunity, we might want to not be so and like anticipating their needs, and allow for a little bit of space and helping them initiate and communicate to us what they want or what they need or what they want to talk about. So this is kind of some more strategies to support that early language development. We want to repeat, repeat, repeat. You want to ensure you're using that proper grammar. So again, with that baby talk we talked about earlier, there's nothing wrong with simplifying your language, really overemphasizing your stress and stressing an intonation of words, but we want to still use proper grammar. We want to use show and tell language. So can you, instead of saying like, can you do this? Can you say show me or tell me? Because that kind of opens the door for that child to give you a longer, more open-ended response. Because if you say like, can you do this? You might just get one short answer versus like, tell me about this. And then you're going to get longer utterances. And again, we don't want to ask, we want to not try to ask your child to copy or repeat a word. We just want to model it. So we're not telling kids to kind of use their words or telling them what to do. We just want to model it and show them and acknowledge that communication attempt. So I think there's one more here about school age language. I just want to flip ahead and see, go to maybe that. Oh, okay. So here we are. We're close on time here. So again, for those school age language development, really, really important for this unique set of learners is we really want to pay attention. So that listening and observing is huge. We want to know that what they're interested in, how they're feeling, how they're thinking, how we can kind of connect with them, because connection is huge. Relationship building and connection is the most important part about any sort of speech and language, like learning, therapeutic relationship, any sort of interaction is about connection. So really paying attention to that young learner. We really want to make sure we gain attention and make sure we have the attention of the child that we're speaking to, because if we're in like a school age classroom and we're giving instructions or talking to a school age learner and they're not attending to us, they're probably not receiving our message, and then ultimately it won't be successful, whichever kind of interaction we're trying to have. We really want to use like routines and activities that the kids are already familiar with to help and support new language learning. And we really want to use their interests, as I was saying. So we want this to be meaningful and motivating to them. I may come in with like a great plan when I'm trying to interact with a school age learner about something that I think is really cool, but if they're not interested in it, they're unlikely to want to engage with it and probably won't have as great of a learning opportunity if it doesn't include something that they're interested in. So that is also really, really, really important. So just under the wire. Thank you all so much. I hope this hasn't been just like a huge kind of info with me just talking for the last hour. I'd love to, if there's any questions or anything that I can do, please let me know.
Yes, thank you, Holly. That was wonderful. Lots of great information.
Oh, my pleasure. I hope so.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
I have questions with regards to multilingual households.
Yes.
I grew up multilingual, bilingual, but I'm teaching my daughter and I am speaking both the English and the Spanish with her. Someone's told me that confuses them because in my situation, my father spoke the Spanish, my mother spoke the English, and so I picked it up. But for me, I'm speaking both to my daughter. And then as a result of that, should I be expecting delays in some of those like 0 to 3 years or whatever, like because she's trying to assimilate 2 languages now rather than 1?
Yes. So firstly, I think that is fantastic. I think having multi-languages present in a home is very, very important. And I always will encourage families to use their home language at home for multi reasons. So if you're speaking Spanish with your daughter and you're living, here in Canada, the way that she is going to pick up Spanish is through you in your home. So if you're not speaking Spanish to her in your home, then she's unlikely to be picking it up in our community, because our communities are generally English speaking here, especially in Western Canada. So I'd say, please continue to do that in your home. Secondly, I always tell families to speak the language that you are comfortable with, because you will provide a stronger language model or a more rich language model if you're speaking the language that you're comfortable with. So it sounds like in your situation that you're saying you're bilingual and fluent in both languages. But what I often, when I say that, is that I have families of perhaps people who have immigrated here to Canada or come or are learning English as a second language. They may often want to be speaking English at home to their child because they think that by speaking two languages, it may cause delays or cause concerns for their children before they're going into school. And that's not the case. If you have that greater, stronger language use in your maternal or home language, like please use that, because you are providing a much greater language rich model. Just like how you were saying your mom and your dad did, right? Like your mom, I think you were saying, spoke Spanish to you and your dad spoke English. And those were probably, maybe I'm making a leap, but were those their dominant languages or maternal languages?
Yes, they were. But in my case, English is my dominant language, but I'm trying to teach her the Spanish. So my Spanish is not that strong, but I'm intent on her learning it.
No, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I'm sure she will get English from, of course, English being your dominant language, and then in our community. And if you're wanting her to learn Spanish, like using Spanish at home is then very important for her to hear those words. They're definitely, sometimes you may see in a truly bilingual home that they may reach some milestones in the individual languages a little bit later. But in actuality, not, because when we're assessing that child, we're looking at both languages together. So like, for example, those kind of 50 words we saw around 18 months to 2 years, a bilingual child, if we're looking at one of their languages, may not have those 50 words. But when we're truly looking at them in that holistic whole picture, if we look at the words they have in Spanish and in English, likely they have the same amount of words as like a single language learner child, if that makes sense. So yeah, so basically, no, this wouldn't cause delays in her language. I think this is fantastic for her to learn Spanish if you're wanting to share. And we also can't underestimate the sharing of your culture and the thing that's important in your family. And that is really, really important to you. And that's fantastic. So I think that's great. There's absolutely no harm or no negative impacts to you teaching her some Spanish words, and it would not cause like a delay in her language acquisition.
Following on from that then is within the activities that you do in a house, it's like, cooking, cleaning, playing, the language is very limited. And I guess when I was a child, we'd watch cartoons in Spanish, and so we picked up that variation that you spoke about that is important. But my reading of Spanish isn't so great, so I tried to immerse her in, like, if I can get podcasts or a cartoon or something like that. However, if you wanted to be sort of ambitious and try to teach them like a third or a fourth language, is it useful, because you said that they've got to be able to copy and see a model and everything else, just to expose them to like a cartoon in Portuguese or Japanese or something? Is that useful? Are they going to pick that up, or is that waste of time and too confusing?
I wouldn't say it's confusing. Like, I think kids' brains are absolute sponges, and they will very quickly realize that this is like a different language. And so I don't think that would be confusing. I think just from that minimal exposure, like by, say, watching like a Japanese cartoon, or just the exposure might be minimal. So I wouldn't expect there to be like a huge amount of language acquisition happening from that. So they may pick up a few words. Like, so I always think of like Dora, for example, who, goes through her adventure mostly in English, and then we'll kind of highlight a few of the words in Spanish. And so you may see some like English single language learner children picking up like, oh, like, my mochila is my backpack, because Dora was talking about that and highlights in the program like the mochila, and then they pause for the kids to repeat it. So you may see some things like that. But I think in terms of like immersion and acquisition, it would need to be much more exposure and modeling to kind of pick up that third or fourth language. Not to say that they couldn't, but
there's no negative impact to that. They're not getting confused because now they've got 4 words in their brain that all mean the same thing in each different language.
No, kids are incredible the way that they can sparse that out. And I think with English being the dominant language, like of their home and of their community, like there shouldn't be any sort of confusion. Like, likely they've already imprinted and mapped that English word onto that object, and then probably learning it in Spanish from your modeling. And then if they happen to hear it on the Japanese program, then I think they would also just include that in their repertoire. So they would be very, very, there may be some like minimal confusion at like when they're first learning it, but overall kids' brains are incredible and able to sparse that all out, like no problem. No negative impact.
Thank you. That's some of the big questions. I was wondering if I was doing good or bad for her.
Oh, I always say every parent is doing great. I know that you are doing absolutely fantastic. You sound like an absolutely caring, attentive parent. And the fact that we're even kind of thinking about these things, like you're doing amazing, not doing anything wrong with that at all. Not that I'm a parenting expert or that, but from my viewpoint, I think you're doing great. It sounds like you're providing a great language rich environment and sharing kind of about your bringing up and things that are important to your culture, like, or your family's culture. That's amazing.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
There is another question in the chat.
Oh, wonderful.
It says, how important is it to have their eye contact during conversation? I often say, please look at me, but this can lead to shutdown. I am a foster parent of children coming from different environments.
Yes. So eye contact has really, really changed in terms of kind of what we know in terms of the field and therapy over the past many years. So many, many years ago, like when I first started being an SLP, like 13 years ago, eye contact, like for any child, like with autism, or even children across like different cultures, like so working with Indigenous children, where we know eye contact, like social communication norms are very different than like a colonizer, like in our like white kind of colonizer settler communities, looks very different. But we would work on that. We would have like eye contact goals. So like, this child will make eye contact with me during this interaction for this many minutes. That would be a goal that I would write. And now I would say, we know that how people listen and receive information, it doesn't necessarily have to look the same. So we kind of have this neurotypical view of how we think kind of conversation communication looks, and that may include eye contact. But for other people, and perhaps also neurodivergent people, and that can include people who have experienced like trauma or disorganized attachment, that looks very different for them. So how they're sending and receiving information, that may look differently. So they may feel more comfortable and more ready to receive and listen to that information or have that conversation without eye contact. That also, like I say, may be a cultural norm in a community that they are from. So I never put any emphasis on any eye contact or looking at me or quiet hands or whole body listening, all these terms that you might have heard. Because again, these aren't very affirming to the child or to the client and what they need. It's more that that's looking through that kind of neurotypical lens. Not saying that you are, like, I understand you're absolutely just trying to support like this child and do what's best and kind of ensure that they're maybe hearing some of your information in this important conversation. But I would say, I usually preface it by saying something like, I want to have an important conversation, or I kind of have an important message to share with you. Let me know, or get comfy in your body to hear that information. So you're kind of letting them know like this information is coming, how you listen best. Like, I want you to do that. So if you want to sit on the floor, and if you need to kind of look away, or if we can be in the car and you want to look this way, or you might need to fidget if you want something in your hand. That's totally fine with me. Like, how your body listens best for this important conversation is great. And eye contact is not like a preface on that. I hope I've maybe explained that well.
That's great.
Yeah. But so yes, I'm sorry, I'm like a natter. I could just keep like talking, but again, eye contact is not that prerequisite, I think, especially for a child who's perhaps like has had maybe some, disorganized attachment or home insecurity coming from a fostering. Perhaps like, again, their brain is wired differently. Maybe how they're viewing this conversation and this interaction may be viewed differently. So something that may be comfortable for us may not be comfortable for them. So we don't need to put that kind of preface on the important conversation that you're having.
Good. Awesome.
Thank you so much. Those were wonderful questions.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, I don't see any other questions, so we'll probably just wrap it up. I just want to remind everyone that we do have another workshop coming up on June 22nd, the behavior as communication. So that's with Holly and as well, Fright, I believe. Right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Fright will be back next week. Yes. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, we'll just wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you, Holly.
Oh, thank you both so much. Sorry, I'm just responding here in the chat. Thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed it. And please, if you ever have any follow-up questions, my email is just holly@speechmattersslp.com. And I always say, like, you're never bothering me. I love to get emails and questions and connect and help in any way I can. So please never hesitate to do that, I often may have like a resource or something I could share with you or anything I could do to help. So
Great. Awesome.
Thank you.
thank you very, very much.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. Let's get stop the share.
And I will stop the recording.